So can you guys see that?
There's a chart I saw recently that I can't get out of my head. A Harvard business professor and economist asked more than 5,000 Americans how they thought wealth was distributed in the United States. This is what they said they thought it was. Dividing the country into 5 rough groups at the top, bottom, and middle 3 20% groups. They asked people how they thought the wealth in this country was divided. Then he asked them what they thought was the ideal distribution. And 92%, that's at least 9 out of 10 of them, said it should be more like this. In other words, more equitable than they think it is. Now that fact is telling, admittedly. The notion that most Americans know that the system is already skewed unfairly. But what's most interesting to me is the reality compared to our perception. The ideal is as far removed from our perception of reality as the actual distribution is from what we think exists in this country. So ignore the ideal for a moment. Here's what we think it is again. And here is the actual distribution, shockingly skewed. Not only do the bottom 20% and the next 20%, the bottom 40% of Americans barely have any of the wealth. I mean, it's hard to even see them on the chart, but the top 1% has more of the country's wealth than 9 out of 10 Americans believe the entire top 20% should have. Mind blowing. But let's look at it another way, because I find this chart kind of difficult to wrap my head around. Instead, let's reduce the 311 million Americans to just a representative 100 people. Make it simple. Here they are: teachers, coaches, firefighters, construction workers, engineers, doctors, lawyers, some investment bankers, a CEO, maybe a celebrity too. Now let's line them up according to their wealth. Poorest people on the left, wealthiest on the right, just a steady row of folks based on their net worth. We'll color code them like we did before based on which 20% quintile they fall into. Now let's reduce the total wealth of the United States, which is roughly $54 trillion in 2009, to this symbolic pile of cash. And let's distribute it among our 100 Americans. Well, here's socialism, all the wealth of the country distributed. We all know that won't work. We need to encourage people to work and work hard to achieve that good old American dream and keep our country moving forward. So here's that ideal we asked everyone about. Something like this curve. This isn't too bad. We've got some incentive as the wealthiest folks are now about 10 to 20 times better off than the poorest Americans. But hey, even the poor folks aren't actually poor, since the poverty line has stayed almost entirely off the chart. We have a super healthy middle class with a smooth transition into wealth. And yes, Republicans and Democrats alike chose this curve. 9 out of 10 people, 92%, said this was a nice, ideal distribution of America's wealth. But let's move on. This is what people think America's wealth distribution actually looks like. Not as equitable, clearly, but for me, even this still looks pretty great. Yes, the poorest 20 to 30% are starting to suffer quite a lot compared to the ideal, and the middle class is certainly struggling more than they were, while the rich and wealthy are making roughly 100 times that of the poorest Americans and about 10 times that of the still healthy middle class. Sadly, this isn't even close to the reality. Here is the actual distribution of wealth in America. The poorest Americans don't even register. They're down to pocket change, and the middle class is barely distinguishable from the poor. In fact, even the rich between the top 10 and 20 percentile are worse off. Only the top 10% are better off. And how much better off? So much better off that the top 2 to 5% are actually off the chart at this scale. And the top 1%, this guy, well, his stack of money stretches 10 times higher than we can show. Here's his stack of cash, restacked, all by itself. This is the top 1% we've been hearing so much about. So much green in his pockets that I have to give him a whole new column of his own because he won't fit on my chart. 1% of America has 40% of all the nation's wealth. The bottom 80%, 8 out of every 10 people, or 80 out of these 100, only has 7% between them. And this has only gotten worse in the last 20 to 30 years. While the richest 1% take home almost a quarter of the national income today, in 1976, they took home only 9%, meaning their share of income has nearly tripled in the last 30 years. The top 1% own half the country's stocks, bonds, and mutual funds. The bottom 50% of Americans own only 0.5% of these investments, which means they aren't investing. They're just scraping by. I'm sure many of these wealthy people have worked very hard. But do you really believe that the CEO is working 308 times harder than his average employee? Not his lowest paid employee, not the janitor, but the average earner in his company. The average worker needs to work more than a month to earn what the CEO makes in 1 hour. We certainly don't have to go all the way to socialism to find something that is fair for hardworking Americans. We don't even have to achieve what most of us consider might be ideal. All we need to do is wake up and realize that the reality in this country is not at all what we think it is.
Well, there's an eye-opener for you on class stratification. It's actually much worse than that now. That video was 10 years old or something, and really just in the last 2 years that the COVID, or year and a half COVID's been going on, the 1% have become astronomically more wealthy. It's just insane. Can't even wrap my mind around how much money these people have. The reason I show that first is I want us to keep in mind that we're going to be talking about racial stratification, but the racial stratification we're talking about is, for the most part, in those little tiny piles of money in the middle, right? So we're basically, arguing over the peanuts in the middle, and that giant stack that's like bigger than all the rest of us combined is just laughing at us, right? So let's talk about racial stratification and arguments against it, and go through kind of basically. I'm just going to real quick try and give you the content you need to answer your prompt for. Keep in mind, this one is only going to be 2 weeks worth of material, and next week we will not be meeting on Zoom. You'll be watching the documentary 13th rather than us meet on Zoom. This is one of those, this is kind of the only module that perhaps that the readings and the documentary have more content than I can possibly lecture on, like our last lecture. So a lot of the actual evidence of stratification is going to be in your readings, and in the documentary you're going to watch. So we're just going to kind of talk about the ideas, that making sense of racial stratification in this country. So the first thing, why don't I share my notes here to make it easy for you? The first thing we're going to talk about is the racial realist perspective. So this is essentially the conservative or right-wing perspective on racial disparity in America. And so the basic point that they make is that there is no racial disparity in America. And if there is any racial disparity in any area that can be shown empirically, then it's a result of the failure of those who make up that disadvantaged group, rather than any type of systematic cause. So the racial realists operate on 3 basic assumptions. The first is that the civil rights movement was a success, right? You guys, I'm sure, are familiar with the civil rights movement in the 1960s and early 70s, and purportedly the culmination of that is the Civil Rights Acts of 1964 and 1968, which ostensibly outlawed racism in America. So it's now illegal to be racist against, someone you're hiring, someone you're considering to rent to, in pretty much any commercial transaction. And the government itself is ostensibly forbidden from considering race in any decision or it makes. However, is that true, right? So we're going to talk a little bit about the reality of that versus the myth that the civil rights movement actually created racial equality and that America is a land of opportunity equally for everyone now, right? Number two is that any failure of African Americans, Latinos, any other indigenous Americans, anyone who has some type of empirical disparity that can be shown, right? It's not caused by a lack of opportunity, because if the civil rights movement solved racism in America and racism doesn't exist anymore, then everyone has the same opportunity. So if you're coming short now, you're coming short because of your own shortcomings, right? It's not that any racism is to blame. You're to blame. You have failed individually and as a group. And so the solution is for you to find the wherewithal to pick yourself up by the bootstraps and succeed in America where others have, and you have so far been unable to. Does that make sense? Or whether that makes sense or not, we'll look at the reality of it. But that's the logic, right, of the racial realists. Number three is that because the civil rights movement was successful, race is now irrelevant in American society, that we are quickly moving towards or have become a colorblind America, where a person's race doesn't determine their outcomes, only their own hard work and gumption and intelligence and whatever determines people's outcomes, right? We had our first Black president, right? So you can't say that African Americans are discriminated against anymore, right? They got a president. Now what else is there for them to achieve, right? So this is the conservative perspective. Now, conservatives generally are opposed to government intervention in anything except invading other countries. But in terms of racism, in terms of empirical disparities, right, that can be proven, conservatives generally believe that the government should not intervene to rectify any disparities that do exist. And the logic for that is the classic we've talked about, invisible hand of the market, right? Conservatives claim, I don't know if they even really believe this, but their argument is that that the invisible hand of the market determines who succeeds and who fails. And because racism, if it exists, would be an inefficient system, because it would be discarding talent that could otherwise be used to profit from, that the invisible hand will prevent racism from being practiced in any practical sense, because it's simply not the most efficient way to run an economy. So put your faith in the invisible hand. Now, another aspect of conservative thought on race is a framing. It creates a framework for thinking about what racism is. Conservatives, and actually many, your centrist liberals too, believe that racism is an individual quality. And so if someone is alleging racism or there's some racial disparity, then one simply needs to figure out who exactly is responsible for that. There must be some racist behind this disparity. And if that person can be identified, they should be held to account. Now, conservatives and liberals, use this type of rhetoric, right? However, they know that in many cases, there is no individual that you can nail down. And even in cases where there is one, they're not going to admit that racism was the reason for the decisions that they made that created the disparity that's been documented, right? So, but aside from whether any individual is culpable in any particular, particular circumstance, right? Focusing on racism as an individual quality obscures systemic inequalities, right? And we're going to talk about this a little bit more in a second. Inequalities that are a result of past racism, that though it may ostensibly be outlawed and presumably, though probably not actually, not occur anymore, right? Even if it doesn't occur anymore, the legacy of racially disparate outcomes when racism was legal still affect our outcomes today, right? So there's two different, it's kind of like it's like a honeypot, right? The individualist perspective, which seeks to focus attention on whether some individual person is guilty of racism. And so people who are, there's this book, famous sociologist who was the president of the American Sociological Association, and a really nice guy too, Eduardo Bonilla Silva, wrote this book, Racism Without Racists. So most people who produce racially disparate outcomes, most of them will undoubtedly deny being racist themselves, but truthfully, many of them don't think of themselves as being racists, right? When they're thinking of what a racist is, they're thinking in that individualist trope. Did I burn a cross on someone's lawn? Do I wear a white sheet over my head and pray to the devil or whatever the fuck they do at those weird little cult meetings, right? If the answer is no, then white Americans, particularly conservative ones, can, and actually these days liberals too, can wipe their hands clean. Hey, I'm not a racist. I'm one of the good guys, right? I have a black friend. The old, I have a colored friend, right? So if a person can not just on the individual level where racism has occurred, and can you identify a perpetrator, but people individually can absolve themselves of any concern or any motivation to do anything about racially disparate outcomes if they can look at their own character and conduct and say, oh, I've never done anything racist, therefore racism doesn't exist, and if it does, it's not my fault and not my problem, right? Another way to think about racism and racially disparate outcomes is legal versus substantive equality. So the racial realist perspective is that since the Civil Rights Acts of 64 and 68 outlawed racism, and since legally it's forbidden to use race as a factor in hiring or renting or any number of different decisions, right? Therefore, opportunity must be equal because legal equality is guaranteed, right? And so the extent of obligation that the government, or really that any of us in society have, to guarantee that racially disparate outcomes do not occur is simply to provide a legal framework that ostensibly guarantees that everyone starts from the same place.
Is that way, like
As
at
long
the
as
end
the
of every,
government can't be racist against people, as long as employers aren't supposed to be racist against people, right, then that's all the government is bound to. Sorry, does someone have a question?
yeah, I was just gonna ask, is that way, like every time you apply somewhere, like I remember even like applying to school, it says like it's like an equal opportunity.
We are an
They do
equal
not,
opportunity employer.
yeah,
We
it's like the
might,
same everywhere.
we might have almost no Black people going to school or working at this university, but we're an equal opportunity employer, and therefore we can't be racist, can we?
Yeah, like we'll consider it, but we
Right?
don't
As
consider
long as we have
it.
that little disclaimer there, then we can't be racist no matter what the actual numbers show.
Yeah,
No matter what the experiences of people who are underrepresented on our campus, we have a
yeah.
disclaimer that says we're an equal opportunity employer, and therefore,
Yeah, like I remember one of my jobs that I had, it was only like female workers, and my owner, like the owner of the company, said she didn't want like any male workers, but she still had that like at the bottom of like each application. It's like, oh well, she considers it, but she's not really for it.
For academic jobs, they have this thing that departments require more and more these days called a diversity statement. So when you're
Mhm.
applying to college, you have to write a personal statement about why they should let you into college and what you're going to do and all that, right? Well, when you're a professor and you apply, you have to write this thing called a diversity statement, which explains how you're going to add to the diversity of the department and the college, even though the department and the college itself may not be diverse at all to begin with.
To you to do so.
It's like, we're going to ask you to have how, what you're going to add to the diversity. Excuse me, add to, there is no diversity in your department. Maybe you should be writing me a diversity statement about what you're going to do other than hire my ass for diversity points.
Why I want to work for you.
Right? They have this classic, universities are notorious for this all across the country. African Americans are woefully underrepresented among students and faculty. So when they do manage to hire an African American faculty member, guess who always gets the call about being in the photo shoot to be on the front page of the alumni book or the website or the whatever it is, right? Like, are you paying me for these extra photo shoots? Because are there not enough other people for you to call to come and be part of your little, it's like, this is like the kente cloth that they lay over the university to hide the fact that there is no fucking diversity, right?
Just a show.
So this is all part of this racial realist perspective, and ostensibly universities are bastions of liberal, politics. But these days there really ain't a whole lot of difference between liberal and conservative politics in this regard, right? Now, what's the other type of diversity? The reality, the material equality, right, is what we call substantive equality. What are the actual numbers? Does the student body and the faculty actually reflect the representation of different racial groups in our society? Does it actually reflect the representation of men and women in our society and transgender folks? Does it actually represent, right, the income distribution, or are all our students from working class neighborhoods and most of our professors from suburban neighborhoods, right? What do the actual numbers show? In America, showing the numbers, hey, look, there's something, like criminal justice disparity is the most obvious one. African Americans are 6 times more likely than white Americans to be arrested, charged, convicted, sentenced to long prison terms for the very same behavior. In fact, self-report data shows that white Americans report what's the number one crime people go to jail for in this country? Drugs, right? White Americans report drug use and actually drug selling at least the same, if not higher rates than African Americans do, yet our prisons are filled with African Americans. That in itself should be hard evidence that there's some kind of racial bias going on here, right? What can you do with that? What if you work at a workplace where the African American and Latino workers never seem to get promoted, and the white or honorary white workers always do get promoted, get paid more, all that type of thing, right? It's actually, this happens on university campuses. When I was a student at Santa Barbara, one of the professors in Chicano studies, she sued the university because she figured out that female professors on average were being paid less with the same background and credentials and education and everything. And they said they gave her a hell of money. They had to, she won. So, this happens everywhere, right? But can you, in a court, right, if you're not a professor that has all these legal, what can you really do about that, right? If there's, at your job, if there's some type of racial disparity going on, right? And you can prove it. Hey, we're not making as much money. We're not being hired. We're not being promoted at the same rates. There's not as many of us being hired, right? You can prove it empirically. You have the data, right? What good does that do you in an American court? None, right? That's not an argument in an American court. The Supreme Court has ruled that demonstrating that racial disparities exist is not proof of racial bias. It's almost like saying you can prove that racial disparities exist, but that doesn't prove that racial disparity exists. What is the standard of proof? This is for your paper too, so pay attention. What is the standard of proof for proving a case of racial bias in an American court, according to the United States Supreme Court? What we call specific intent. Specific intent. So in order to prove a case of racial bias, you have to prove that the reason this is happening is because some individual, right? Some person is guilty of racism. And you can prove that either because you have some smoking gun evidence, an email from them, right? Like the guy from the Raiders coach. He didn't have much of a case because there's all these emails, like it's on paper, documented. But how often does that really happen, right? How often is someone stupid enough to put their racism in an email to document it so it can be used against them in court, right? Or what's the other way to prove that racial bias actually was at play? The person has to admit to it. Oh, you know what? Actually turns out I wasn't hiring these people all this time because I'm a fucking racist. And what? Does that ever happen? Right?
Oh, Professor.
Think about the standard of specific intent compared to the legal standard in other types of American jurisprudence. In criminal law, when someone's arrested for a crime, do they have to admit to guilt in order to convict them? Do we have to have an email or a document where they admit to, yeah, you know what, I actually did it. Oh, you found that email that said that I did it? Damn, I'm going to prison now. No, right? We convict people to life in prison. We execute people in this country on the basis of hearsay, right? And circumstantial evidence. Juries have a great degree of latitude to decide what they believe happened and whether someone should be convicted or not, whether in fact there is any smoking gun evidence, much less an admission, right? So why is proving a case of racial bias, why is the standard so much higher than in criminal cases where we're executing people? You'd think the execution would have the higher standard of evidence, right? Not in America. What's the other problem with bringing a case of racial bias in America? Thanks to the Supreme Court. And actually, I should say also to successive Democrat and Republican administration. If you're the victim of racial bias, how do you rectify that? Is there a U.S. Attorney's Office of racial bias that will prosecute your case for you? Like they would if you were the victim of a crime, presumably? You have to go out and find a lawyer yourself. And either you have to pay them or they have to take the case with the expectation they're paid a percentage out of any verdict, any judgment that's rendered in your favor, right? So you have to fund your own prosecution to prove that you're the victim of racial bias. How many of you out there, I'm sure probably some of you have experienced racial bias at work. How many of you have the resources to would even know where to start to find an attorney to represent you against your employer? Who has more resources, you or your employer, to pursue and defend a legal case? Right? Is it even possible for you in the position you're in to fight a legal case against your employer? Well, how would your employer react if you were to bring such a case? Probably fire your ass off the bat, which is illegal, by the way, not that it would stop them. Right? So the problem is that while ostensibly there's legal equality, we're legally, there's that disclaimer, we are an equal opportunity employer. The fact is there's no enforcement mechanism, right? There's no mechanism to enforce when a tort has occurred, when an injury has occurred, right? Even if you can prove, you have the data proving that there is disparity occurring here, right? You can't, number one, you don't have the resources to bring the case in the first place. And even if you did, number two, it's virtually impossible to prove, right? So now let's talk a little bit about durable inequality. So what explains the type of durable inequality that you're going to read about, or you should have read about today, but you will by the time you have to write your paper. The type of racial stratification that there's so much evidence of, right? Why is that still occurring if supposedly the civil rights movement made America equal and we all have equal opportunity and so on and so forth, right? Number one, opportunity hoarding. What Charles Tilley calls opportunity hoarding. Charles Tilley is actually a professor at UCLA. So if you were high class enough to have been accepted to UCLA, then he would be your professor instead of me. We'll talk about our apartheid university system in a second too. So opportunity hoarding. Now this occurs in essentially two ways. One is what we call employment nepotism. So prior to the civil rights movements, it was perfectly legal to be biased against someone in hiring on the basis of race, right? African American, Latino, Asian, indigenous, you know, pretty much anyone who wasn't white, and even a lot of people that we would consider white today, right, were legally banned from being involved in any number of different industries, right? In most industries for that matter, right? And only certain, you know, mostly service and labor-oriented jobs were reserved for people of color. Now, those good jobs, right, that were hoarded by white people back when it was legal to exclude non-white people, what happened to those jobs in the next generation? Their kids, right? Fire department's a good example of this. It used to be you couldn't get into the fire department unless a family member brought you in, right? And so if your grandfather was a fireman, why was your father a fireman? Because your grandfather brought them in. And so you have the opportunity to become a fireman, right? Because your family, generation from generation, were firemen. Well, if the reason that your grandfather was a fireman was because he was white and black and brown people couldn't even apply to be a fireman at that time, right? Then the fact that you're a fireman today is still a remnant because of that racism that occurred back then, even though ostensibly today, the fire department is an equal opportunity employer. See how that works out? They can give you that little disclaimer, but if they're still perpetuating a system that hoarded opportunities within a certain class of society, right, then that opportunity is going to be passed on to their children and to their children and to their children. So if your great grandparents and grandparents and parents didn't have those opportunities to pass on to you, then you're not going to benefit from that, right? Even though we live in an equal opportunity society. See how that works out? The other way is through elite education institutions, right? People think that you know, getting into a top tier school is about getting a better education. Actually, you know, Charles Tilley probably would be teaching you somewhat pretty similar to material to what I'm teaching you. What's the biggest advantage of attending a top tier university, particularly, you know, like an Ivy League school, something like that, Stanford or, you know, NYU, some wannabe Ivy League school? They tell you this a lot when you're young. If you want to succeed in life, you have to network, right?
The connection.
So what's the network of people that you're exposed to that you're able to make connections with if you go to Harvard or Yale or UPenn or whatever, right? Versus your classmates are the children of billionaires, the children of political dynasties, right? The children of attorneys and stockbrokers and millionaires. And so even if you're not one yourself, you have a lot of opportunity to get to know people who are, and that's going to provide you with a lot of opportunities over the course of your life because of the network of people that you know. Now, what's the network of people you're going to know if you go to Cal State LA? Bunch of other broke ass people, just like the rest of us. We're all peasants together. Right? We're all in the same boat. So how are we going to get out of the boat when there's a yacht sailing by, right? And we can't swim, right? It's that's an opportunity that gets hoarded, right? And gets passed on generation to generation with, like a lot of these schools have legacy admits. People are admitted to school even though their grades aren't up to par because their family has gone there generation after generation and their family's wealthy and they contribute money, right? So opportunity is something that's passed on from generation to generation, even though now ostensibly everything is equal. The other major the other major reason for durable inequality is what we call disaccumulation, right? Inequality is cumulative. Just like accumulation is cumulative, right? What's the point? We already talked about this a few weeks ago. What's the point of capitalism? Is to accumulate wealth, to reinvest, to accumulate more wealth, to reinvest, to accumulate more wealth until you're, I guess it's not Jeff Bezos this week, it's Elon Musk, right? Until you're the richest man in the world. But it goes the same way the other way around, right? If you lack opportunity at each stage, that compounds for successive generations, right? Let's talk a little bit about that. So just like the fire department, right? Most unions in American history have been closed shop unions, closed to people of color through most of their history. Now, there have been a couple of exceptions to that. Actually, the first big union in the US, the Knights of Labor, was a racially inclusive union, except for Chinese workers, which is unfortunate because they recognized the value of organizing white and black workers together. But because of the competition for work in the railroads, they were opposed to Chinese immigrants. But the first attempt to organize American workers by the Knights of Labor actually tried to bring white and black workers in the same union. But the Knights of Labor was crushed by workers, just like you saw in the documentary Plutocracy you watched for the first segment of the class. And the AFL-CIO became the major union conglomerate, which has, just until the civil rights movement era, was racially exclusive. And so same thing, those union jobs get passed on from father to son to grandson and so forth. Right. There was one other union that was racially inclusive in the early 20th century, the IWW, the Industrial Workers of the World, which was an anarchist trade union, which still exists today. But unfortunately, they weren't able to organize too many industries under their banner. So opportunity hoarding leads to disaccumulation. Let's talk a little bit about housing segregation. Housing covenants. You guys know what housing covenants are? It used to be perfectly legal to deny non-white, and actually some white people, Jewish people and people of Eastern European origin and so forth, the ability to buy or rent in certain neighborhoods. And not just certain neighborhoods, most neighborhoods, right? Here in Los Angeles, you can tell which areas were subject to housing covenants and which areas were relegated for Black and Latino folks, because they still are, right? Why is East LA overwhelmingly Latino, Chicano? There's, most of the zip codes in East LA are 98% Latino. Why is that? The Chicano people think like, hey, this would be a great place to live up on top of this hill. So I have to walk up this giant hill every day when I get home from work. Because of course there were no cars 100, 150 years ago when these neighborhoods were laid out, right? Maybe it'd be nice to live down here in the flats. So every rainy season when the LA River floods, our whole house gets washed away, right? Wouldn't that be nice? Clearly, these were areas that were abandoned by Anglos. And so Latinos were relegated to live in East LA, both because it was undesirable to Anglos because of the topography, which now is not as big a problem because we have cars to drive up the hill, and the LA River has been paved, so it doesn't wash out every year like it used to until the World War II period. What's right next to East LA that needed labor, right? What did all of San Gabriel Valley used to be? Fruit orchards, right? So it wasn't that Chicanos chose to live in East LA. Chicanos used to live everywhere in LA and California before Anglos arrived here, right? But after Anglos came and imposed housing covenants, they were relegated into tightly circumscribed neighborhoods by law, right? Why is so-called South Central a historic African-American community? Did African Americans come to the Los Angeles basin 140 years ago and decide, hey, you know what? This would be a nice place for us to live. Let's all create a little commune right here. No, right? Like I said, African Americans were did not have the opportunity to engage in most industries. And so one of the few things that African Americans could do for work was day labor, taking care of horses, shoeing horses and shoveling shit in the Army terminal that used to be on Central Avenue. Okay. So it wasn't that African Americans and Chicanos chose these neighborhoods. Housing covenants forbade them from living anywhere else. And even after housing covenants were ruled unconstitutional in the late 1940s, right, redlining maintained these neighborhoods as overwhelmingly African American and Latino, and even worse, made it extremely difficult for people to own their own homes and accumulate the wealth that real estate represents and be able to pass that on to their children, right? Redlining is a banking practice that presumably doesn't exist, but still does exist, right? And essentially what it consists of is banks, lenders, people who lend the money for home loans, decide that certain neighborhoods are too high risk of default. And what neighborhoods are these? Should we ask Inspector Clouseau? Right? Clearly, these are neighborhoods that are overwhelmingly occupied by Black and Latino people. And so how does it work? Number one, in many cases, they won't give home loans to people who live in these neighborhoods because they're too high risk. So the only way to own a home, if you can't get a loan, is what? You have to save the cash year after year, decade after decade, until you have enough cash to be able to buy a home outright. How realistic is that for people who live check to check, working class people, right? So basically people who live in communities that have been redlined are relegated to being permanent renters. They're not even able to get a loan to be able to be paying a mortgage instead of paying a rent. And so if you pay rent your whole life, what do you pass down to your children? A big fat nada, right? Now, even if you are able to get a home loan in one of these red line areas, the interest rate is much higher than a comparable interest rate would be for someone with the same credit, with the same education, with the same income, everything, if that same home was in a suburban community. because presumably you're in a at-risk, high credit risk community. So you're paying more over the life of the loan than your counterpart who's living in the suburbs. Right? Makes sense? So that's another way that poor neighborhoods are kept poor, and people of color, particularly who live in these neighborhoods, are kept poor. The other one is ghettoization. All this stuff, by the way, is from your Nancy Denton and Massey and Denton reading that I think I have down for next week. But anyways, how are ghettos made, right? Because these areas are already demarcated as the home ground of Black and Latino people, of poor people. When the government started building public housing and providing funds for public housing in the post-war period in the late 20th century, where was this public housing built? Where are Section 8 vouchers issued for? Which communities? The same communities, right? So people who need public housing or who need Section 8 vouchers, who are overwhelmingly Black and Latino, are further forced to congregate in these communities, even though they ostensibly have the freedom to leave them. But you can't if you're on public assistance, because where are all the housing projects? Is it a coincidence that all the housing projects are in East LA and Boyle Heights and Watts? And should it surprise anyone that the vast majority of Section 8 vouchers in this county are issued in a very limited number of zip codes in East and South LA, right? That perpetuates the ghettoization or barrioization, right, of Black and Latino communities. So it's like the metaphor is the web, right? The spider web, popular tattoo. People have that spider web, right? Because once you're stuck in the web, like you can't crawl your way out. There's all these things keeping you from being able to even get to parity with the people who live out there in the suburbs, right? Not that, there aren't a couple of lucky souls out there that manage to break free, right? But for the vast majority of people, it keeps people stuck in the same neighborhoods. Another one is education apartheid. What's the number one predictor of familial wealth? The two. Well, number one is familial wealth. Familial wealth predicts familial wealth. Surprise. We need an Inspector Clouseau for that one. Number two is education, right? Education is a very strong predictor, and particularly not just any education, but R1 education, education at a Research 1 university, right? Versus an R2 university. Guess which ours is? We are an R2, a Research 2. The UC system are the R1s. Stanford, Harvard, NYU, Columbia, those are R1s, right?
So what would community colleges also fall into the two?
It's not even a university. That's why they call it community college.
Oh, so it's not.
Yeah. So community colleges are even below R2s, right?
Oh, wow.
And where do most people in working class communities go to college?
Community college.
Or CSUs. Just look at the racial makeup of the CSUs versus the UCs, right? If you just look at us in UCLA, right? 10% of our students are white, and 2/3 of our students are Latino. At UCLA, it's almost the flip. Now, we both do fucking horrible at recruiting African-American students. I think we both have about 3% when African-Americans make up, 12 or 13% of the Los Angeles County population. But even for Latinos, there's this huge disparity. Just look at the numbers of the student bodies, right? And you'll see that our state schools, our public university system here in California is a blatantly apartheid university system that relegates students of color, and particularly students from working class communities of all colors, to the city college and CSU system, and white students, and particularly upper class students of every color, are overrepresented in the UC system, right? And you look at the Ivy Leagues and the wannabe Ivy Leagues, it's a lot worse, right? Just like the difference between our primary and secondary schools. Think about the difference in the high schools that you went to in South or East LA, or wherever you're from, versus the type of schools they have in Newport Beach or Corona Del Mar, or Westlake Village, somewhere like that, right? Which schools do you think have more resources for students? How many of you had to fill out scholarships and college applications in high school in order to graduate and didn't go to a charter school? Right? Does Dorsey High and Manchester and Morningside require their students to fill out college scholarships and college applications in order to graduate? They do in the suburbs, and they do in the charter schools too, right? Like my wife was supposed to go to Morningside. She got lucky and won the lottery and went to Animo Academy. At Animo, they do this, but at Morningside, they don't. Isn't this the same community? Aren't these kids coming from the same school? How come Morningside can't do that, right? So this educational apartheid occurs just like the criminal justice system at all levels, from primary to secondary to city college to university, right? And what determines which university and which graduate program you're going to attend in large part? Your GPA, your SAT scores. We already talked about how bullshit intelligence tests are, right? But what else? Your pedigree, right? Schools like Harvard and Yale want to admit students who come from schools like Harvard and Yale, right? Actually, here's another one with us in UCLA. We haven't had a single student from our sociology program admitted to UCLA's PhD program. Not a single one. About half of our lecturers are either doctoral students at UCLA or students who got their degree at UCLA, as well as a number of our tenured faculty in our department. And even though UCLA trained all of the people who were doing the teaching in our department, not all of them, but a lot of them, our students, not one of our students is qualified to go to UCLA for a PhD, right? Can it be any more obvious? We got the data, but what can you prove? Is there anybody that sits on the admitting committee at UCLA who's going to say, hey, you know what? Our bad, we've been racist this whole time. I'm sorry, we've been treating you like peasants. We need to admit more of you peasants. Right? So at every level, right? And UCLA is a pretty top tier university, but it ain't no Harvard or Yale, right? So let's continue. Labor market discrimination, right? Does labor market discrimination continue to occur today? Ask any employer. What are they going to say? We're an equal opportunity employer. It says right here on the application. Didn't you see that part? It's right at the bottom. It's where you can't miss it. Right? But do employers make racially biased hiring decisions? Right? Of course they do. And of course we know that from our own anecdotal experience, but we also know that from reams and reams of research that's been done and published proving this. Probably the most well-known in the last couple decades is this wonderful woman who was a professor at NYU when I was there. And unfortunately, I think she just passed away. I think it was just a couple of years ago, Diva Pager. She did this when she was at Wisconsin. I'm presuming, this was in Milwaukee, which Milwaukee was ostensibly a Democratic voting city, right? So supposedly this is in a progressive city. It's not like they did this in Birmingham, Alabama or some damn place, right? She had graduate students, black and white, role play different positions. So there was black and white, and then there was the person who just graduated college, no criminal record, and the person who just got out of prison with no education whatsoever, black and white. Guess who the employers were more willing to hire? Of course, their number one choice was the white person with the college education and no criminal record. Guess what their second choice was? The white person who'd been to prison with no education was chosen consistently above the black person who just got out of college with no prison, no criminal record whatsoever, right? Now, if Deidre Pager went around to all of the businesses that they did this and asked the proprietor, excuse me, we sent some people in here to apply for jobs and you only wanted to hire the white, you even were willing to hire the white ex-con over the black college graduate. Like, are you a racist? Would any of those people been like, yeah, I'm a racist. I don't hire black people here. Probably fucking not, right? Well, you never know these days. Since Trump became president, a lot of people coming out of the closet with their racism, right? But needless to say, this doesn't require someone for there to be, aha, we found the racist, right? But in the aggregate, when you look at the results of all of this research that's been done in every area, as you guys are going to read for your reading these couple of weeks, right? In every area of American life, you see these racial disparities. It's inescapable, right? So let's talk, having said all that, let's talk a little bit about white privilege. That's what white privilege is, right? White privilege isn't necessarily mean that every white person has a great life or that, they get every opportunity that's coming to them, right? It's that in the aggregate, white people have all of these advantages. Now, that doesn't mean every white person has these advantages. And that also doesn't mean that people that we consider non-white also may not have these advantages, right? Look at Barack Obama. His father is from Africa, and presumably he's the first African-American president. But who raised him? And what was their economic circumstances, right? He was raised by his mother's white family, who were not filthy rich, but certainly well off, right? And because of the opportunities they were able to provide him, he ended up taking advantage and went to law school and made a career and ended up becoming president, right? But he benefited from white privilege, even though he's not actually white, right? Now, for people who are unambiguously white, presumably all people who are white, who are unambiguously white, benefit from white privilege in that while they may face many different, struggles and travails in their life, none of them are due to racial bias, right? So it's not that people of color don't also suffer from many different travails, but there's one that people of color have that white people just simply don't, and that's racial bias, right? Now, that being said, 65% of African Americans have no net value, no net wealth. They have no property, they have no assets, they have, or if anything, they're in the hole, right? Now, 25% of white people are in the same condition, right? Now, there's about 5 times as many white people in this country as there are black people. So actually, there's more white people out there who have absolutely fucking nothing than there are black people, surprisingly enough, in the aggregate, even though black people are much more likely because of racial bias to have nothing. Do those white people who have nothing also enjoy white privilege, right? They ain't got nothing, but they got something. At least I'm white, motherfucker. It's like a consolation prize. The material circumstances of your life may be just as fucked up as these other people over here, but it's like a, it's like a party favor. Here, take this little party bag, at least you have that, so don't complain. Right? It's like it's the consolation prize for people who otherwise are at the bottom of the American, remember that curve? We're all down there in the peasant section, with one, maybe if we're lucky, two little stacks of money, right? So what difference does white privilege make in the life of someone who's white that's destitute materially? Not much at all. Destitute is destitute, right? But at the same time, it's like a psychological wage, right? It's what a famous sociologist called the wages of whiteness. That even if your material circumstances are nothing but fucked, at least you have this, but at least I'm white, America, right? You see a lot of this kind of sentiment in the last 5-6 years, right? America, people who realize that they have absolutely fucking nothing going for them, right, are very defensive of their whiteness, because that investment that they have in that is paying less and less dividends every year. And they see that. And they feel very upset and threatened about that. Why? Because that's all they have. They don't have any material. The capitalist economy doesn't provide them with a material basis for being proud of themselves, right? That white privilege, that wages of whiteness makes them feel like they have something, when in reality, they got the big fat nothing that the rest of us have, right? How about reverse racism? I think we touched on this before. Is there such a thing as reverse racism? Or can white people be the victims of racism? Can people of color be racist against white people? Why not? What's the first facet of the race concept is that it's a hierarchy, right? The race concept was invented as a hierarchical system with white people at the top and black people at the bottom, and everybody else somewhere in between. So if the race concept was invented with white people at the top, then how can white people be the victim of racism? Now, white people can non-white people be mean to white people? Sure they can. Right? Maybe in some cases deservedly so. Can they be biased against white people? Of course. Can they be prejudiced? Right? Can they be disrespectful to white people? Yes. Is racism the correct word to describe any of that? No. Right? Let's take it a step further logically. Can people of color be racist against each other? You hear a lot of this in the media. Mexicans are racist against black people, and black people are racist against Mexican immigrants, and so on and so forth. Is it possible for people of color to be racist against anyone? No, right? The race concept was invented with white supremacy at the top. So racism is a word that can only describe the bias of the dominant group, the white group, right? Now, all of the rest of that, bias, prejudice, whatever other words you want to use, are accurate, but racism is the wrong word to describe that, right? Mexican people cannot be racist against African-American people, and African-American people cannot be racist against Asian people in America, because America is a white supremacist society. Now, if the land back people succeed and kick all the white people out, and turn the racial system around, then sure, then maybe you could create a new racism or something, right? A good example of that is Israel, right? Jewish people were the victims of racial violence and racial oppression in Europe, and now that they've moved to Palestine, they're the perpetrators of it, right? So in that case, the positions did flip, right? The population that was the victims are now the perpetrators, but that ain't happening in America. At least I can't see it in the foreseeable future. So until that happens, right, racism is not the right word to describe bias that occurs in any direction other than down from white people. Now let's talk about what reforms did our authors suggest as solutions. Now these are, you should think of these as politically liberal. So this is your classic liberal position. Number one, institutional investment. Because working class communities, and particularly Black and Latino communities, suffered from underinvestment as a result of redlining and the lack of FHA loans and GI Bill and so on and so forth, right? Because of that, there should be, you know, some people use the word reparations, but there should be some type of massive public investment in communities that have suffered from disaccumulation. Number two is wealth creation, right? Programs should be aimed at rectifying past wrongs and restoring the wealth that was taken in many cases, or building wealth where it was not able to be built thus far. A good example of this is the LA Times reading I included for today on Bruce's Beach. Anybody follow this thing? It's actually apparently been resolved. There's this African-American family who owned a good chunk of Manhattan Beach back in the day, 100 years ago or something, and built, back then African-American people weren't allowed to use swimming pools and beaches with white people. So they built a beach club for African-Americans so that they could enjoy the beach too, right? And what happened? The KKK basically that used to run Manhattan Beach, or still does, I don't know, took their land, right? Used eminent domain to steal their land, and oddly enough, over so many years, never really did much with it. In fact, most of the land today is just a park, right? And so finally, after years of people complaining about this, now Manhattan Beach really didn't want to give the land back. But I think it was the state forced them. And so now the Bruce family is finally going to get the land that was stolen from their grandparents or great-grandparents all those years ago. Now, is Manhattan Beach paying rent for the 100 years that they've kept this land? Is there a lease agreement, right? No. So at least they're getting the land back, but it's a perfect example of disaccumulation, right? If what your family had 100 years ago was taken from you, then what if it hadn't been taken from you? Then all of the wealth that would have accumulated over those years from the businesses would have been helping the family today, right? But until they got the land back, they had nothing. And now at least they're getting some piece of land to do, hopefully, something that will support the family with, right? Number three, entitlements, which is what conservatives like to call them, right? In Europe, they call them social services, right? Which is very common in Europe, but unknown here in the US, right? In Europe, this is gonna fuck you guys up. Education is free in many countries, right? In Denmark, I go to Denmark every now and then because I've advised some gang intervention programs out there. In Denmark, not only is tuition free, they pay you, I think it's $2,000 a month or something, to go to college. You get paid a salary and they give you housing. So you have no tuition, they give you housing, and you get a stipend of, I forgot what it is, $1,000, $2,000 a month. You guys are like, fucking shit me off to Denmark. Right? Can you imagine? Right? Why don't we do that in this country? We don't have the money. We can't afford it. We built a, $1 trillion jet that doesn't fucking work. But we don't have money to pay students to go to college. All the companies are crying, we don't have enough workers to hire. For some reason, we can't find any workers to hire. Right? We just built this wall and now we can't find anyone to hire. We can't find enough skilled workers, even though we expect them to go into debt for the rest of their lives to get the education to qualify to even work for us in the first fucking place, right?
And then not pay them enough to actually pay off the debts they accumulated in order to work for them. So really,
you'd be better off paying off a debt to the mafia than student loans. Have a better chance of paying that off, right?
but isn't like the government kind of like early on, like isn't kind of like the government like the mafia when it comes to like student loans and student debt? They take away everything if they know that you have something you can pay it.
As a famous anarchist said once, the state is nothing but gangsters for capitalism. That is why the state exists. Another entitlement, healthcare. Right? I crash every time I've been on a two-wheeled vehicle my entire life. I crash it on the first day. I love motorcycles. I would love to purchase one and to ride it every day. The wind in my hair, but every time I even try and get on one, I crash it. So what do? I went to Ibiza, this little party island out that Spain owns in the Mediterranean with my friends. First thing I did, get me a little motor scooter. First day, crashed it. Yeah, thank God I had a helmet on. I'd probably been killed. And I got all torn up hamburger meat, right? And I went to the clinic, the doctor there, and he gave me some antibiotics and, cleaned my wounds up and all that, and gave me some gauze. And how much? Can I give you my insurance card? What's an insurance card like? Right? I have a friend that happened to be in UK, in London, and had a horrible toothache, an abscess in his tooth. Went to go see a dentist. They extracted the tooth, took care of the whole thing. Would have cost thousands of dollars if you did that here. No bill. Can you imagine? Think about of those of you who are even lucky enough to have insurance in this country. Fortunately, because of my job, I'm lucky enough to have insurance. Every time I go to the hospital or my baby goes to the hospital, they won't even tell you how much it's gonna cost. So you can make a decision about whether it's worth risking your life for that much money or not. Right?
And even then, every hospital has its own charge.
You have no idea how much you're going to be charged until they give you the bill.
You know what they found? They found like in some, they just did it in an article about it, is that they found that it's actually in some cases it's better to say like you don't even have insurance because the cost is a lot more lower. For like say a CT scan, something that it would cost you without insurance.
Without insurance, then you must have money to pay this
dollars or something, and with insurance, like 1,200, 1,400.
Yeah, hospitals are under no obligation to make their charges consistent from patient to patient. They can charge one patient whatever they want and charge another patient a totally different charge. It's perfectly legal, right? In most countries in Europe, particularly in Western and Northern Europe, there are no charges. You get hurt, you get sick, you go to the hospital. They treat you, you go home. That's it. Can you imagine that? It's hard to even imagine as an American, right? Now, if entitlements, education, housing assistance, healthcare were given to everybody, let's just forget about race for a second. What if we gave everybody guaranteed housing and everybody guaranteed healthcare and everybody could go to college for free? Who would that help the most? Who's the furthest back in the race of life in America? People of color, right? Since people of color are overwhelmingly disadvantaged by all of these things, then even if we brought everyone, including white people, to parity, who would benefit the most, right? Number 4, but to conservatives, that's giving people something for nothing. Funny how the people who are against giving something for nothing are the same people who keep buying fucking Bitcoin and wanting something for nothing. Is there a strong correlation between these two people? Number 4, stronger discrimination laws, right? We have a Civil Rights Act of 1964 and 1968. The problem is that they're unenforceable, given the way the Supreme Court has interpreted them and the lack of, support that the Congress has given. Shouldn't they be passing laws that create a U.S. Attorney's Office of Racial Discrimination to find cases of racial discrimination and prosecute them at the taxpayer's expense to make sure that racial bias is not occurring in our society? Right? But no matter how many blue waves we have, no matter how many times we vote blue, no matter who, they still never do shit about it, right? Number 5, diversity and inclusion. You gotta love those keywords. Sounds so, makes you feel all warm and fuzzy inside. Diversity and inclusion. Who could be against that, right? Otherwise known as affirmative action, which, if you think about it, affirmative action is really about the top tier elite schools, when it comes to education, right? We don't need no affirmative action here at Cal State LA. We're already overrepresented, right? It's Harvard and Yale and those elite institutions that need Berkeley and whatever, Stanford, that need that diversity and inclusion. Why? Because they don't have any diversity. Number 6 is decriminalization. So the 13th documentary is really gonna, and your Michelle Alexander reading, are really gonna break down well. I mean, criminal justice is like the most, racial disparity in this country. So what's the solution? Is to just decriminalize things that don't need to be a crime in the first place, like drug use and minor property crimes, things like that, right? If we decriminalize behaviors across the board without regard for race, just like with, disadvantage, who are we helping the most? Everything you decriminalize, who benefits from that the most is the people who are the most criminalized. Who is that? Right? Instead, even liberals love criminalization, right? What's their favorite one? Gun control. We need to get these guns off the streets and get illegal guns out of the hands of criminals and blah, 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 blah. Who do you think it is that gets arrested for gun control violations in this country? Us, right? It ain't Billy Bob Joe out there in Texas with his machine gun mounted on the back of his truck, right? It's Black and Latino, particularly young men, who are charged with firearms violations, right? In this country. You guys probably know some of them. Anybody know anybody who's got a felony for having a gun with no crime committed? And then every time they get caught with the gun after that, it's another felony. Why? Because they had a gun the first time. What if we decriminalized everything? Right? Who would benefit the most from that? Those who are most criminalized today. Cool. Any questions about any of that before I cut you loose and we see if the Dodgers are losing yet? All right. So next week, instead of us meeting on Zoom, you'll be watching the 13th documentary on YouTube, all on your own lonesome at home. Then you'll be turning in your paper the following week, and we'll start on our discussions about nationalism.
Professor, I have a question.
Go ahead.
I haven't submitted my my assignment. I was wondering if I can submit it later on tonight.
Yeah, as long as you turn it in before the next paper is due, there will be no penalty. However, do take your time if you need to, because there will be no rewrites for this one. I let you guys revise the first one because that's the first time you've seen what my paper looks like, but now that you know what it looks like, I expect you to get it right the first time from here on out.
Okay, then thank you so much.
All right.
Thank you so much, Professor.
Any other questions or comments? All right.
Thank you.
Go Dodgers. See you guys in a couple weeks. Salud.